Okay, so today we're putting it all together. We are going to look at how to graph with all the different parts of a sine or cosine function. So we're going to graph using amplitude, period, phase shift, which is the horizontal shift, and vertical shift. And we're going to start with one, a cosine, and we're going to do a cosine and a sine. So my first equation that I have is y equals the cosine of 2 theta minus pi. And what I would like you to do, because I believe this helps you, especially for next week when we start working backwards, is I like to list everything. So I have my amplitude, my period, my phase shift, and my vertical shift. Well, my amplitude, the number in front of cosine is nothing, so it's just 1. It's that imaginary 1 there. The period, you take 2 pi, we're going to use this number for period, divided by 2. So the period is pi. The phase shift. This is what we were trying to lead to yesterday in class. If the period changes, so the period is not normal, it's pi instead of 2 pi, the phase shift changes. So to get the phase shift, you actually take this value, pi, we have pi, and you divide it by this coefficient. That coefficient of theta changes your graph. So it's going to be pi over 2, which this one we don't even have to simplify. So the phase shift is pi over 2. It's a minus. So with all the parent functions and everything we've talked about, that means it's going to go to the right. So you're going to move everything pi over 2 to the right. Vertical shift, there's nothing out there, so that's 0. What I like to do is I'm going to draw my graph just like we started when we started them last week. My period is pi. So here's pi. Here's 0. I'm going to find my 5 critical points. Pi over 2 is the middle. The quarter would be pi over 4. 3/4 would be 3 pi over 4. And this is what I do. And I think for a lot of you, this is going to help you graph these. I graph the amplitude and the period first. And I make that a dotted graph. So my amplitude is 1. The period is pi, which I got. And it's a cosine. So if I had nothing else, my amplitude and period together would be this dotted graph. But now I need to add in my phase shift and my vertical shift. Well, my vertical shift is nothing, so I don't need to worry about that. My phase shift says I need to go pi over 2 to the right. That means I need to take this point and move it pi over 2. Which this one is awesome, and a lot of problems that you're going to do are great because pi over 2, we already know. That means I have to take this point and move it over pi over 2. This point goes right there. The problem that you're going to see in a minute is I may need to add to my x-axis. So I move this one. Here's my second point. I'm going to move it pi over 2, so that's 2 units. My minimum value was at pi over 2. I'm going to move it 2 units. Now here's what happens. This point right here, that was here, I need to move it 2 units. So basically, I'm going to have to erase where my arrow is. I'm going to have to add on. So I can move this point. So the next one, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, this one would be 5 pi over 4. And then this one would be 6 pi over 4, which is 3 pi over 2. So now I'm going to go back. I'm going to move this point 2 spaces, because that's pi over 2. And I'm going to move my last max pi over 2. So now my graph is the same cosine graph, it just slid over. It slid over this way, pi over 2. That's my phase shift.
Excuse me for the interruption. As a reminder, we do have district vol.
All right, after that minor announcement there, we're going to try another one. So we did the cosine of 2 theta minus pi. We're going to try one with a sine, and I'm going to put all 4 things, amp, period, phase shift, and vertical shift in this. So the equation we're going to start with is y equals 4 sine of theta over 3 plus pi over 2 plus 1. And like I said, I really think it would be best to list all your parts. So amp, period, phase shift, vertical shift. Amplitude, 4. Period. Period can be found by taking 2 pi divided by, this would be 1/3, which is equal to 6 pi. And phase shift, well, this is the new one. The phase shift, you take this constant out here and divide by this coefficient. So pi over 2 divided by 1/3 gives me 3 pi over 2. And then you look, this is a plus, so that means it's going to go to the left. It's going to go to the left. Vertical shift, we got this one down, +1. So up 1, +1. So when I graph, I told you that I graph period and amplitude first. So I'm just going to graph those. 2, 3, 4. I'm putting 4 on there because my amp was 4. I may have to add more. My period is 6 pi. So here's 6 pi. My 5 critical points, 0, 3 pi is my middle, 6 pi. So then this would be the average. So that'd be 3 pi over 2. 0 plus 3 divided by 2. This one's going to be 3 plus 6, which is 9, divided by 2. So 9 pi over 2. I'm just showing you a different way of getting that. A lot of you have your own way of just multiplying fractions. I'm just using an average this time to see if that might work better for some of you. So I'm going to graph amplitude and period first in a dotted graph. So my amplitude is 4, my period 6 pi, graphed, I got my scale done. It's sine, it starts at a 0, it goes to a max, it goes to a 0, it goes to a min, and it goes back down to a 0. That's what that looks like. Now, I need to add my phase shift and my vertical shift. Well, my phase shift says 3 pi over 2 to the left. Once again, this is awesome because I already have 3 pi over 2 on my scale. I don't have to approximate. So 3 pi over 2 to the left would just be one spot here, negative 3 pi over 2, because that's my first quarter mark. So I'm going to move everything over one spot to the left, one mark, one coordinate. And I'm also going to move it up 1. So I'm going to put my vertical shift in here. I'm going to draw this. I like to draw this midline. I notice most of you like to do that too. So there's that midline. So basically I have to make 5 points move. So I'm going to take my first point, I don't know what color I want here. First point, over pi over 3 to the left and up 1. There's my first point. Second point, over pi over 3, which is 1 mark, and up 1. So I'm actually right there at +5. Next point, over 1 mark, 3 pi over 2, and up 1. This one, I'm going to go over 1, up 1. So I'm at -3. Over 1, up 1. And then I draw in my graph, and there I have, whoops, missed the point there. There I have my graph. I have a phase shift, and I have a vertical shift. So my phase shift went this way, 3 pi over 2, and I took my phase shift up, or my vertical shift was up 1, +1. See you in class tomorrow. We're going to graph things just like this. Thanks.